Hello, everyone. This week we're talking about plants again. We're kind of in the physical realm of bioenergetic agriculture, where we just take a moment and really develop some reverence for plant process. It's a little bit plant biology 101, maybe 201, but I find that it's really worthwhile to take a moment and really get into the guts of plants, if you will. Last week was more of the broad context of, the anatomy of a plant, the taxonomy of a plant. We talked about the angiosperm leap and kind of went philosophical for a minute, trying to understand, where plants came from and how. Good luck with that. Fascinating stories. We introduced a little Terence McKenna. How you do that in plant taxonomy is, I guess, sort of a trip, but hopefully you saw some parallels there with this concepts of concrescence and the eschaton and the increasing complexity of not only plants in terms of going from the bryophytes to the angiosperms, but in terms of the world we live in. And one of the things you'll find me draw out of this information that I'm putting forward over time is kind of the parallels of life, if you will. It's kind of like, the compost pile is the gut of the landscape, right? When we get sick and we have to take antibiotics, we take some probiotics. We add the microbes back, we eat some yogurt, whatever your strategy is. Compost tea is the same thing for the soil. So it's just very interesting to see that, these biological systems working in that capacity. And not unlike the pattern recognition conversation we got into, that Josiah showed us that great example of, you really find the truth in those parallels. I find that with Rudolf Steiner and his work, that you'll hear me talk about him in a lot of different ways. He's just been such a big influence on me and my work. But a lot of what he saw and his ability to see back in the 1920s is happening. And the way in which he presented it was maybe counterintuitive to the age, but looking back and looking at where we are and, seeing the truth and the disconnects of how our society is built in terms of the threefold social order and these kinds of things, you really see those parallels quite starkly. And I use the analogy of agriculture and how it occurred in 11 different places relatively at the same time with no communication between them. It was an impulse, So, I think it's important to connect with these kind of philosophical and spiritual tracks. And what we'll do today is talk about, the plant physiology, what's inside the plant. How does the plant respond? How does a seed germinate? The carbon cycle in a big picture, drilling down to the fulcrum nature of a plant within that cycle. I mean, in a very real sense, we're here because of plants. We wouldn't be able to breathe otherwise. There's a very beautiful synergy between plant life and human life. They complement each other, and they're kind of a yin and a yang. And we'll spend some time in future talks really investigating that from a literal and a spiritual context that I think is really worthy and interesting in and of itself. But today we're going to kind of get down and dirty with some plant processes: photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration, and giving you a couple tidbits on how it's relevant towards our agronomy, especially in the end. And this really sets the stage. Once we understand, how a plant processes work, we'll move into, well, how do plants eat, and then what do they eat, right? What's fertilizer? Why is it important to have mineral balance, these sorts of things. So basically, I love this quote in this picture here. They tried to bury us and they didn't know we were seeds. I think it's very apt for the times that we're in. There's a lot of very difficult scenarios that are being generated by the society that we've created. And I really have a lot of hope towards our ability to turn that on its head. And speaking from an agricultural standpoint, that's regenerative agriculture, what I call bioenergetic agriculture. It's, as I've described it before, it's conventional agriculture is drowning. Organic agriculture is treading water. Bioenergetic agriculture is swimming where you want to go. And the only way to really do that with any kind of intention is to be aware of the platform that we're playing on. And if you think of physical and mineral components of a living system, that's conventional agriculture. You plow and you fertilize, and then you try to kill all the problems that you created, not being mindful of the life force and the microbial diversity. So organics brings in the conversation about microbes and growing soil and these kinds of things, but they both completely discount the energetic capacity, the life force conversation. And that's what biodynamic agriculture that Steiner articulated. He actually never used the word biodynamic, but what it's become is a spiritual scientific approach to farming. But it doesn't talk about microbial diversity. It doesn't talk about mineral balance or cover crops or things that are entirely relevant to proper agronomy. So what we try to do is just create a big net platform that's constantly changing, learning, and growing, so that we can talk about it in a coherent way. And when we do that, what we find is our perspective becomes aligned with how the system works. And then what we find from that is that we draw all sorts of value by getting the system to work for us. So, that in a nutshell is what bioenergetic agriculture is. So, just starting from the beginning, there was a seed, right? And the seed is a miraculous thing. It's fairly simple in observation, but it works in a really miraculous way. And here you've got a cross section of a seed. You can see the cotyledon in there. These are the first two leaves that come out. They're actually just kind of a knee jerk to the germination process. The first photosynthetic leaves are actually the second set of leaves, the first set of true leaves. And then you have what's called the radicle. The radicle is the root that pops out. If you've ever soaked seed for sprouting or paid attention when you're germinating your seeds, every seed will stick that root out, and there the process starts. And then the turgor pressure that's created by the plant developing inside busts the seed open, and you may have grown some sunflower sprouts or something like that, and notice that the seed will stay on until the leaves get the cotyledons big enough to kind of pop it off, and then you're off and running. So what happens in the seed is that it responds to primarily moisture and heat. It's one reason why you don't need to put light on germinating seeds. There's a process called etiolation that is done through sprouting. And it's kind of fascinating to do. You can germinate the seed. A lot of wheatgrass growers and sprout growers do it to create an even germination, and then they put the light on it, and within an hour or so you can see the green pigment begin to start. It's pretty cool to see. But essentially the moisture infiltrates the seed. It starts a process down in the endosperm of the plant, and it swells it and cracks the seed, and there the radicle goes, and you're off and running, like I said. So you can see this process to fruition here. You have the seed, the heat and the moisture of the season, and whatever you're irrigating with, the rain if it's passive, germinate the seed. The seed coat is then popped off. The cotyledons come out. You can see the second set of leaves there being the first set of true leaves. So this process is slightly different for different crops. The cotyledon scenario is different from a monocot to a dicot, as we talked a little bit about last week. But that's basically the physiological process of seed germination. And it's if you take a step to the side and maybe back, the process of how that seed is matured is really a culmination of the point of the organism, right? Like, it's something I talk about in hydroponics a lot. A plant wants to grow, but it doesn't want to grow roots necessarily, right? What its goal is to produce fruit, seed, in order to reproduce. That's the real nuts and bolts point and goal of a plant. So as agronomists, as people that want to nurture the system to get the most out of it, what our goal is to help the plant do that most effectively. And again, that's just to highlight one of the values of sitting here for an hour and talking about these things in terms of plant process. We can really get intimate with it. And when we can imagine what the plant's doing when it's doing it, what we'll find is that we'll encourage that to happen in a much more profound way. And a lot of times it's just subtle, simple recognition of the plant process can bring more out of the plant. And you probably hear me talking, in my retail store days, we created an environment where people could talk about things in a comfortable way, and talking to their plants, and homeopathic farming and all kinds of cool stuff. And it was always really humbling and inspiring to me how many people actually talk to their plants. Um, and the average person may call them crazy, but they've done it in a way that gave them this experience and this confidence that what they were doing was productive. So that again, just a way into kind of the mindset that I try to bring to this. It's not so much an authority of this is the way you need to do it. It's really just begging a little bit of imagination towards what we're trying to accomplish. So, on a grand scale, you have the carbon cycle. You may have seen this graphic or a graphic like it, and there's a lot of dialogue in the media and the mainstream these days about carbon. We're looking to tax carbon and all of these things. And I could probably sit here for an hour with my opinions on that. And I'm a little confused by it. Let's just say there's more going on than meets the eye. I've seen, indoor grow rooms where you supplement CO2 up to 1,600 parts per million. Our air is about 400 parts per million. Plants up to 1,600 parts per million. You can always watch the plant grow. It's the limiting factor. Everything else being ideal is the amount of carbon in the air for the plant to actually photosynthesize from. So it's always been a conundrum for me is, as the CO2 in the air rises, why is the plant growth not tracking with it? And what, the result of that is that I'm not going to sit here and claim to be an expert on climate change and these sorts of things, but there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. But as you can see in this graphic, you got the sun coming in, you got photosynthesis happening, it's cycling the carbon. There's a very real, measurable influence in the carbon cycle of the ability of the soil to retain carbon and to build carbon. In a lot of ways, we're leveraging the Earth's ability to do that on its own in the modern times off of ancient sources of this, peat bogs or any of the oil that we use for making plastics or driving a car. All of this is ancient sunlight, which is kind of an amazing idea. But tracking carbon through this process is you can't have that conversation without plants. So, I wanted to show you this quick video of some friends of mine. They have a group called Kiss the Ground out in California. And this video, I think, does a really good job of explaining the carbon cycle and at the same time, giving a real good visual for it. So check this out.
Do you feel hopeless about climate change and the damage we are doing to our planet? I did. But then I was shown a new way to look at the problem, which made the solution so obvious and so within reach. A solution that's right under our feet. Climate change is all about too much carbon in our atmosphere. But carbon's not our enemy. It's the building block of life. Everything alive is made of it. It's us. The problem and the solution are simply a matter of balance. Let's step back and look at the 5 pools of where carbon is stored on planet Earth. Starting about 500 million years ago, when plants appeared on land, carbon began to cycle in an amazing balance, a balance that allowed for life as we know it to evolve. Then one life form, us, figured out how to extract carbon from the fossil pool. Then we burned it for energy, putting it into play, disrupting that balance. The way we manage land and do agriculture is moving even more carbon from the soil and biosphere into the atmosphere. Specifically, we've moved 880 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is heating up the planet and destabilizing our climate. Now, the oceans have absorbed a lot of this excess carbon, which is resulting in ocean acidification and accelerating a mass extinction of sea life. So in order to save life as we know it, of course, we have to stop releasing fossil carbon. The big question is, where do we put this excess carbon to get this cycle back into balance? Well, remember when I said that the solution is right under our feet? It literally is. It's the soil. Plants, with sunlight and water, perform photosynthesis. They pull in carbon from the air and turn it into carbohydrates, sugars. Then they pump some of those sugars down through their roots to feed microorganisms who use that carbon to build soil. Voila, carbon moved. Plants pump it in and soil stores it. Nature's living technology is amazing. Scientists have recently discovered that applying a thin layer of compost sets up an ongoing positive feedback loop that brings more and more carbon into the soil each year. In concert with other regenerative practices like not tilling the soil, planting trees, cover crops, and planned grazing, we can build and retain gigatons of soil carbon. This is carbon farming. This is regenerative agriculture. And there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Unlike more carbon in the atmosphere, more carbon in the ground is good for us. It makes healthy soil, which is nutrient rich, full of life, and holds way more water. This means more nutritious food and crops that are more resilient in the face of drought. That's good news for farmers, families, and everyone that eats. Remember this: the way we grow our food, fiber, and fuel either puts carbon up into the atmosphere or it pulls it down into the ground. The regeneration of soil is the task of our generation. Our health, the health of our soils, and the health of our planet are one and the same.
Yeah, what a cool story. I agree with Ryland. I think the regeneration of our soil through agriculture is the task of our time. Um, I I have a hard time imagining anything that's more important, um, and really relevant and disruptive towards the problems that we have. I mean, agriculture really is a touchstone for, if you think about it, every aspect of every issue that we face. Economic security, food security, job creation, health. We have the leaders of, our politicians giving joint session in Congress speeches about healthcare, and food is never even mentioned, right? I mean, how can that happen? And we know better than that, and that's really the challenge, is to kind of build these awarenesses and these systems. And it's why exercises like what we're doing here are so important. It's sharing information and kind of getting a resonance around the work that we need to do. Ryland is the co-founder of Cafe Gratitude out in California. If you're in that area or ever find yourself out in Los Angeles or San Francisco, check it out. It's a vegan outlet for it's like vegan fast food, if you will, and it's amazing what they do. So it's a bit of an aside. But Kiss the Ground's a great organization. You can find them on Instagram or Facebook, and it's worth connecting with them to see the stories that they're telling about the farmers that they're working with. It's a really good meeting point for being introduced to progressive farmers. So check them out if you have time. So look at this guy. This is a plant cell, and there's a lot going on there. The magic happening in the chloroplast there. And we're going to get real comfortable with that here. And you see, like the mitochondria, this is the source of cellular respiration, and the ribosomes where the proteins are created, and the vacuole, that's kind of the pressure center that, can regulate the pressure of the cell and the structure of the cell based on, what it needs to be doing. And the ability of the cell to communicate with its outer environment. If you really boil it all the way down, what we want to talk about in terms of agronomy, on a microscopic level, particularly talking, water and mineral nutrition and oxygen, dissolved oxygen, cellular respiration in that context, is the ability of things to get in and out of the cell. So, these processes are extremely complex, and I'm not going to get down into the testability of remembering all of this. What you'll need is will stick. But the takeaway here is that the cell is the engine of life, right? And if things can't get into and out of the cell efficiently, then you're not hitting the sweet spot. And this is one of the things we'll talk about when we get into water. Is that the structure of water can affect the ability of things to get in and out of it, to bring ions into the cell, oxygen into the cell, and take away toxins. So what we find is that our cells in our bodies are malnourished in the way that we eat and in the way that we drink water. So part of what we'll get into in terms of how to leverage some of these processes we're learning about is just a general awareness of that. If you're not getting things into and out of a cell, you're not really productive towards the point of what we're doing there. So as complex as this is, plant fertility and process really comes down to two processes, photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis is a process by which elements, carbon dioxide and water, are combined in the presence of light energy in the chlorophyll to form carbohydrates or glucose. So the culmination of photosynthesis is the production of glucose. The respiration is the process in cells by which chemical energy is released in a series of metabolic steps involving the consumption of oxygen and the liberation of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. In a lot of ways, they're opposites. They're complementary. They work together, but they work in opposite ways. Photosynthesis is really a building up process, and respiration is a breaking down process. And it's very interesting to see the breathing exercise there, right? The earth breathes. That's a biodynamic principle. It breathes in the winter and it breathes out in the summer based on the equinoxes, right? And that's why in a biodynamics posture, you're burying the potentization of the herbs and the materials that you're using in the winter or the summer based on the process that you're trying to accomplish. There's some very deliberate reasons for the way in which biodynamics is conducted. So we'll get into that in a lot more detail when we get into that realm. But photosynthesis first. Photosynthesis is literally the synthesis of energy. It's from light. And energy defines life, on the level of the sun coming in, on the level of the plant utilizing it to produce and be productive. Plants make their own food, right? That's what makes them amazing. That's what makes them responsible for supporting all life on Earth. It supports all organisms. We talked about the fossil fuels and the ancient sunlight that we're leveraging. So the challenge that we have is how do we put that into a forward-thinking posture so that we can be sustainable, and even more important, to be regenerative, to kind of clean up the mess that we've created trying to get all this stuff figured out. So here's the equation for photosynthesis in words and in a literal sense. Carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight equals glucose plus oxygen. We breathe out carbon dioxide, the plant brings it in, it spits out the oxygen, and the result is the glucose. Now, it does utilize oxygen in respiration, just not nearly as much as it produces, right? So just clear that up front, because there can be some confusion there, potentially. So what the plant's doing is photosynthesizing from sunlight, right? This is a schematic of a typically used in indoor grow light arena. But it gives you a feel for the peaks of photosynthesis. It's not fair to say that certain wavelengths drive photosynthesis and others don't, in the context where we're learning more about this in every day. It's really amazing the level of energy and research that's going towards being able to grow plants artificially with artificial light indoors. And it's getting to the point where you can start to talk about it being efficient, even above and beyond sun-based growth. I wouldn't say that we're there yet. But the challenge is to try to learn what plants use in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum. And if you look at, I should have put a slide in here about how small that visible light is relevant towards the length of the electromagnetic spectrum. You think about things like the infrared. These things are happening, and many life forms can see it. Pests use it to, see unhealthy plants. They actually can view it. A plant fed a lot of nitrogen and nothing else can grow fast, but it's obese. And nitrogen defines amino acids. The metabolism of a plant can't keep up with the influx of nitrogen that the human is forcing the plant to eat. And the empty proteins vibrate at frequencies of formaldehyde and ammonia. And it actually is a visual signal to a pest, and they pick it up through their antenna, like an old school TV antenna, literally. And they see the food, and they eat the empty proteins. That's pest food. So one of the indirect results of taking proper agronomy from a balanced approach is that you kind of utilize the pest control from the inside of the plant. You're mitigating the food source the pest has. It's not possible to live in a bubble and prevent the pest from being there. What it is possible is mitigating its food source and strengthening the plant so that it can protect itself. Plants make their own antibiotics, their own pest controls, their own antifreezes, all sorts of magical things that are restricted by a lack of trace elements. And that's something that we'll really drill down on in the mineral conversation as well in the coming weeks. So, you have this photosynthetic reality here, and you can see some peaks in the red and the blue, and it's kind of what we know, and it's being updated. And the goal of a grow light is to match this as closely as possible. And there's the PAR index, photosynthetically active radiation, is a way of loosely measuring it, but without being able to define exactly what a plant needs, it's difficult to hit the mark with 100% efficiency. LEDs offer an ability to be even more efficient, because LEDs are singular wavelengths. But the problem with using an LED is the human has to pick the right spectrum of diodes. If they don't, then the spectrum's not conducive. So LEDs are entirely relevant from an efficiency standpoint, but unless the technology from the human perspective has learned for that crop what is best for that plant, then it's better as a supplemental light. This is something that we probably will take some time on in the future, controlled environment agriculture. But the point today is simply to relate the fact that there are certain aspects of the spectrum that are used more than others for plants. Where this happens is in the chloroplast. You have, this is really where everything happens in terms of life on Earth, in my opinion. And so you can see the format here, the granum being the stack of the thylakoids, comprising where the chlorophyll resides. And that's actually, we're going to watch a video here in a little bit that's really going to detail this in a cool way. So the point here is this is home base right here for photosynthesis. Looking at check this out. This is just a quick visual of a plant working. This is cytoplasmic streaming. It's basically the chloroplast moving in a very simple plant that it's an aquatic plant, and called Elodia, and it just gives you a visual of what's happening. Very simple. You don't have a lot of the high metabolic processes that we've been talking about, but it's really neat to see this stuff work. This is life in motion right here. And these processes really allow us the ability to live on Earth. So you can see the central vacuole we saw in that diagram is basically the way in which the plant regulates its pressure. And so when it needs to fill a space, the vacuole can be increased. When it needs to move in a different way, it can get smaller. And so there's all kinds of complexity whenever you get it out into a plant process. But just look at that. Especially with the classical music, it's quite beautiful. So think about the wonder of photosynthesis. What we want to look at here is what does it look like? Again, you got the chloroplast, you got the granum, the stacks of thylakoids. The thylakoid, you can see, has clusters of the chlorophyll embedded into it. And then moving out of the physiology of the plant to look at it molecularly, you can see what it looks like. This is really complex compound here, and magnesium being the cofactor, what defines the structure of the chlorophyll. And what's really interesting is that the structure of this molecule mimics blood. Now, there's a different cofactor, right? You've got iron in the middle there instead of magnesium. But if you look, and there's a couple of other little differences, such as the length of the carbon tail and things like that. But the point being here is that the metabolic structure of this is similar. And that's fascinating, right? I mean, it harkens back to what I was talking about earlier. You have these parallels of system, compost pile that got of the landscape, this kind of thing, right? Like, seawater, the mineral balancing, mimicking the blood balance, which explains why sodium chloride is so bad for us. It's not sodium and chlorine's fault. It's the imbalance of everything else that's not with it. And our cells losing water and the vacuoles pushing water out to regulate that imbalance is what hypertension and bloatedness and water weight is, from a high sodium diet. So, in that vein, this is totally a mind blower for me. The idea that these materials, these fundamental, crucial materials, they look like each other. There's a similarity in their function and in their process and in their structure. So I think that's really important to highlight. It just kind of shows you the importance of chlorophyll, as if we don't already understand that. It's literally the blood of the plant, in a very literal sense. So within photosynthesis, you have two major categories of process. You have the light reaction and the dark reaction. The light reaction is what I guess in general terms, we have a familiarity with the glucose production of photosynthesis and the utilization of carbon dioxide and the production of oxygen and these sorts of things. So, but this is one step into the detail, and we could go 3, 4, 5, 10 more steps into it, and we're not going to go there. But what I wanted to get across was just this general idea that it's not a black and white. It's not a one-step process. It's a cascading effect of the plant producing the energy it needs to move something into one form to another, which is, cold fusion, if you will, right? It's like, people tell us we can't, we got laws of thermodynamics, and here we are talking outside of that box, which is a really cool place to be. But you got basically the production of what's called ATP. Is generated through this light. ATP and NADPH are generated through the light reaction, and the water is split to release energy that can be leveraged to produce these materials, and then those materials that are produced in the light reaction are then used in the dark reaction to generate the glucose carbohydrate that is the source of basically everything a plant does. A plant doesn't stop at glucose. That's the end of photosynthesis. What picks that up is the respiration, which we'll talk about in a second. But you can see from this graphic here that, wow, there's a lot going on. So just kind of follow this for a second. You got, you're increasing the energy level of these electrons by inviting the light energy into the plant. So you've built the energy up into the ATP and the NADPH, and then those materials are then put into the dark reaction. The dark reaction is also called the Calvin-Benson cycle. So you follow all of this complexity, and to simplify it, what you've done is basically leverage the sun to create a source of energy that drives the next step in the process. So let's stop for 1 second and just ask ourselves, how did plants figure this out, right? And there's a lot of really good answers for that, and I don't know the right one. But it's worthy to just really create a little reverence around the simplicity and the complexity of this process all at the same time. So you move from that production of the ATP and the NADPH, you built up that energy. That energy is then leveraged to create glucose. Now that is what's called the dark reaction, the Calvin-Benson cycle. So here's the equation for it. And you can see, you're amounting all of these energy sources that you built up through the ATP and NADPH into the glucose molecule. And you can kind of see the full process here. You've got this light coming in, called photophosphorylation, is when water is leveraged to release the electrons that activate the ATP and the NADPH, which you can see moving down into the Calvin-Benson cycle. The ADP and the NADP positive that are resulted of the production of that glucose then go back to be photophosphorylated again through that light reaction, and rinse and repeat. So, there's a graphic of photosynthesis. This is a different one. I think I actually prefer this one a little bit better, just on the flow of it. But you can see light going in, water coming in, oxygen going out, NADP positive and ADP coming from what was happening in the Calvin cycle to produce the ATP and NADPH that moves back into there to leverage that carbon dioxide to produce the sugar. Amazing. So what you end up with is this carbohydrate. One more angle of this is through words. Light enters the chloroplast, chlorophyll in the grana, hits the chlorophyll. The energy is leveraged to create the photosynthase that moves down into the production of the glucose. So that glucose is really the food is plant food, and then in the way that we as autotrophs eat food to sustain us, the plants are using this light energy. So this video hit me in the right way. Hopefully it will you. And I think it just gives you a little bit more of the detail that I just thought was a little better delivered through the video. And it kind of takes a pretty cool angle on the quantum mechanics of photosynthesis. So check this one out.
The leaf, it turns out, is a remarkable piece of technology. Light lands on a leaf in quantum energy packets called photons. Every second it spends in bright sunlight brings a leaf thousands of trillions of photons. And almost every one of the red ones is captured and its energy processed. Let's trace the path of that energy through the plant. The first stop is the antenna, an assembly of hundreds of thousands of chlorophyll molecules. Hit by the photon, an electron within the chlorophyll will become excited and use the extra energy to bounce through the antenna to a bridging area. This is composed of a complicated arrangement of chlorophyll molecules. You can imagine it as an intertwined maze of rope bridges that, if you can find the path through, lead to the all-important reaction center. Once at the reaction center, the electron creates a permanently separated charge that is essentially energy that can be stored. It's the same thing that makes a fully charged battery such a useful source of power. At that point, the energy is safe and properly stored, ready for use by the plant. There's just one catch. The reaction center is a nearly impossible place to reach. Getting through the bridging area is a nightmare, and it has to be done quickly. The maze of wobbly rope bridges will absorb all the photon's energy if it takes too long to find the reaction center. A packet of energy has about 1 nanosecond to get across the bridge. Some might chance upon the right path and make it through in time. Most, though, won't. This is where the quantum tricks and Gregory Scholl's research team comes in. Their conclusion? Our results suggest that the energy of absorbed light resides in 2 places at once. This weird phenomenon is officially known as quantum superposition. It is written into the mathematics of quantum theory, which describes the position of a particle only in terms of probabilities of finding it in various different places. In certain circumstances, the particle can occupy multiple positions at once. And it turns out that to achieve the remarkable efficiency of photosynthesis, algae and their evolutionary descendants, plants, employ quantum superposition so that the energy can simultaneously travel along all possible paths to the reaction center. That way, it always gets there on time. As far as we understand it, when a photon of sunlight hits a leaf, its energy is passed to electrons within the leaf's chlorophyll molecules. Those excited electrons move to the reaction center not by random hops, as was thought, but by exploiting their quantum mechanical ability to take all available paths at the same time. It's such an exciting discovery because it raises the possibility that we could do the same. If the messy world of biology can exploit this quantum mechanical trick to the maximum by evolutionary trial and error, perhaps we can deliberately engineer the same feats to occur in our own solar panels.
It's pretty cool. There's people out there working on anything you could ever imagine. And that idea of replicating photosynthesis is as obscure and far off as as you can imagine it feels like, is a very real thing. we can move to an arena of regeneration and abundance in regards to how we operate as humans with that kind of mindset. So again, very worthy to keep our imaginations fresh in that regard. So that, even in that video, you see, as we've kind of harped on here a little bit, the result of this process being glucose. So here's some of the uses of glucose. It's used for energy and immediately. That's the excess energy is sent down to the roots and tissues of the plant to be stored for later use. That's a lot of the food that we eat, right? So that happens in tubers in a potato, or the fruit of a mango, whatever it may be. A lot of that information energy is put into the repairing of the plant, to make the physicality of the plant. Basically, on some level, it's kind of like, we talked about the meristem of a plant last week being the stem cells of plants, but in a lot of ways, glucose is the same way, right? It's this raw material that can then be digested by the plant through the process of respiration that we'll talk about now, and turned into just about everything, into everything a plant does, I should say. So the importance of glucose and the process of photosynthesis to produce it obviously can't be overstated. And respiration is not as well understood. It's not as popular, let's say. It occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. You can see that the equation up top is leveraging the glucose molecule and using oxygen, right? I mean, we're so used to thinking about plants, utilizing carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but they actually use oxygen as well. That's one of the number one reasons people kill their houseplants, is overwatering, and the plant just can't respire. It's suffocating the plant through its root system. And that brings out the root diseases. And here we are blaming the organism, when the organism is just doing exactly what it should be doing. The parasite in that context is putting the plant that's stressed out of misery, basically. So, like I said, in a lot of ways, this is an opposite process. And there's a lot of complexity around it. You can just type in glycolysis or electron transport or the citric acid cycle, and you can really see some of the complexity of this process. But in the general sense, what we want to take away is that photosynthesis builds things up, and respiration breaks them down into the components that the plant needs to be a plant. It converts the sugars produced by photosynthesis into plant usable energy using oxygen. So again, here's a little side-by-side that kind of really drills the point home. Photosynthesis produces the food, respiration uses it. Photosynthesis stores the energy, respiration releases it. Photosynthesis uses the water, produces water, uses carbon dioxide, produces carbon dioxide, releases oxygen, uses oxygen. You see the theme. Occurs in sunlight. Respiration, this is one of the major differences, happens without the presence of sunlight. So, quite fascinating. At every point of life that we look, you've got a complement. And I believe that human consciousness kind of lives in the space, in the balance, if you will. But our ability to be conscious of these processes defines our success and our ability to do that. So hopefully you got a little bit out of that comparison. Wanted to talk about transpiration for a minute. This one's a little bit of an outlier. It's obviously important. We're familiar, generally, that plants are like a straw in some respects. They're pulling oxygen, or water up through the plant. It's a motility thing. It's an ability to move things through the plant, and it's kind of the way in which plants can use that, what they can fix through their roots and their leaves. One of the things that I always found was really valuable to understand about transpiration is the scale of it. 1% of the water a plant absorbs is used in photosynthesis, less than 1%. So the majority is there just to move through the plant, to help it maintain its turgor pressure. And as we're aware, 90% of a cucumber is water. It's quite amazing. But look at these numbers on the bottom two bullet points there. An acre of corn transpires 3,000 to 4,000 gallons of water a day. That's amazing. One single mature oak tree can transpire 40,000 gallons a year. So this water, as we're aware, and my daughter's 10, and I'm teaching her about uh, water, and she's just kind of become aware that there's water in the air, and she's just so inspired and blown away by it. And it's a simple concept. It's humidity, and if you live where I live, and you live through a summer where I live, I should say, you know exactly what humidity is. It's pretty much like swimming through the air. Um, but we take these things for granted. Water is ubiquitous, and again, I can go down some tangents with water. And I'm going to try to temper myself a little bit, but there will come a time in our time here where we start to talk about water in an intimate way, and the ability of water to move through a plant can be manipulated and enhanced. I call it activated water, and it has to do with the molecular structure. Water is a lot more than wet. But what's happening in a plant is it's basically moving through the stomata of the plant. Plant's breathing in the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. It's releasing the moisture, and there's a very delicate balance that the plant maintains through its intelligence and its ability to maintain its organism. So you can see, this is done not unlike the vacuole of a cell. The turgor pressure is there's a vacuole in the guard cells as well. It's a little bit more pronounced, and it can be enhanced to open the stomata or reduced to close it. And so, when that might happen might be on a humid day. The plant doesn't want to or can't lose any moisture. That's one of the reasons you don't want too high of a humidity in a grow room, for example, is you prevent the plant's ability to have the loss of the water pull more water behind it, right? And back the plant up a little bit. And then conversely, if you've got really dry conditions, the plant may want to protect itself and not allow its moisture to be released. So all of this is innate to plant. It's kind of like breathing for us, right? We don't think about it, but it's happening all of the time, thankfully so. So there's some really delicate processes involved here. And, so you can see this water is conducted through the xylem. And that's where the water comes in, and it's transpired through the stoma of the leaf. And there's, this may be a slight oversimplification, but I think it's relevant, and it's an insight that I was really saw value in when I first considered it years ago. Was that think of the root as an osmotic gradient, and this, if you don't remember osmosis from the schematics in school, essentially what you've got here is a visualization of osmosis, and this dotted line through the middle and the bottom here is only water can move through that. So these little dots are ions. Just think about it like table salt, right? So if you put more of an ion that can't move through this on one side than the other, the water is going to move to balance the concentration to be the same. That's called osmosis. So in a very real way, the roots are an osmotic gradient. And what the plants needs is, because it's not necessarily engineering this, but it wants a higher concentration inside the root than outside the root. That's basically the context of transpiration. If there's more ions in the root than out of the root, water's coming into the plant to balance the concentration, right? So that's a very healthy plant, transpiring, moving water through itself. You may have heard the concept of burning a plant. The edges of the plant burn, and it doesn't kill the plant unless it's extreme. And typically you can just dilute any fertilizer application that you've ever done, but everybody's burned a plant, right? I mean, we kind of are, and you kind of want to, in some respects, like in hydro, you want to push the plant, and even in soil growth for that matter, you want to push the plant to the amount of fertilizer that it wants. So the plant's growing up more than it's growing down. When you've got a weak fertilization or immature soil, the plant's got to expend a ton of energy to get to the surface area that it needs to maintain its metabolism. So if you increase that concentration to the plant so that it doesn't have to go looking as much, the plant grows up and instead of down. And what it's doing is growing more fruit, developing more seed, right? Back to what we were talking about earlier, the point of the plant is to reproduce. So you're leveraging that ability, and that's one of the reasons hydroponics works so well. But the reason you burn the plant is because more ions are outside the root than inside the root. Therefore, water leaves the plant, right? So burning a plant is, in literal sense, is a water stress. You're sucking water out of the plant. And, visually it makes sense because the edges of the leaves are burned. The plant's prioritizing, right? It's sending the moisture in to the middle of the leaf and sacrificing the edge. And it can only survive in that context for so long. But that's why plants burn. I always found that interesting. So, to give you a little kind of context around that, this is, typically one of the things that I talk about in hydroponic presentations, but what you're looking at here is parts per million, or EC, electrical conductivity. They're basically the same thing in a different posture, where you have like the US system and the metric system. They're different numbers, but they mean the same thing. They're a conversion of each other. So typically in the US, we use the 500 scale of parts per million. One EC is 500 parts per million. So in this context, the number is not really as important as the range is. Look at a lettuce plant. You're at 800 parts per million, 800 parts per million. If you go above that 840 parts per million, depending on the strain of lettuce that you're growing, the plant will burn. You've reached the tipping point, the threshold of that plant to transpire and utilize the nutrition you're providing for it. But look at the tomato, anywhere from 1,400 to 3,500. So what this says is you're not going to feed the lettuce plant and the tomato plant the same amount of fertilizer in the soil. In hydro, you wouldn't grow them in the same system. Otherwise, you'd have to grow them to the bottom end. And you're sacrificing what the tomato is capable of. That, in a nutshell, is the benefit of hydroponics, right? You're allowing the plant to grow up instead of down. Another way to look at this is any potting soil that you buy from a garden center, let's say, is going to be on the lower end, because they're not going to sell a product that you put your lettuce plant in and it'll burn it all up, right? Bad for business. So what's done is the concentration is just simply diluted in that base soil to the extent that it provides a one-size-fits-all for every crop. But a lot of the results that people can get are sacrificed by not imagining they can feed their tomatoes more, or whatever crop it is that they're growing. So I always find that that's value to reference. And there's a reason that this conversation is important. I mean, don't get me wrong. You can feed everything the same thing, one size fits all, and maybe get enough to eat and have a hobby. But on a commercial level, what we're really looking to do is maximize the cost benefit of our agriculture, right? If we use a fertilizer, we need to know that fertilizer is producing a value more than its cost. In a lot of situations that I see, the fertilizer is used just to produce anything at all, right? Which basically says your soil is really immature. Most farmers, and I'm not saying that I know more than them in their farming and what they do, but miss the opportunity of getting the soil to work for them. They're looking at the soil like a sponge. They're not setting it up with any kind of life force, biological activity that leverages that ability. They haven't balanced their base saturation. These are all things that we do through our fertility management services. They give you a window into the balance that we seek that allows us to move towards that goal. So there's very real reasons to focus on this. You can see this is an example from an Australian hydroponic conference that I've used as an example for many years. And you can see the increase in a lot of the relevance of why we grow plants, paying attention to this tomato crop. They moved from 1,600 to 2,450. And when they did, they increased the shelf life, the EC, or the ionization of the sap, the acids and the simple sugars and the bricks are all moving in the right directions for the crop. So, this is not just a cool thing to do. It actually has relevance in what it is that we're looking to get out of agriculture. So in some sense, today was pretty simple. We told each other what we already know. Plants support life on Earth, that plants make their own food through photosynthesis, and they break it down through respiration, and they're self-supporting in that capacity. And in the capacity of those processes support life on Earth. And, knowing these plant processes and how they work improves our farming. I've seen this happen, especially with homeowners that are, just kind of hobby growing, is, they're burning plants and they're afraid that too much nitrogen is there. They're thinking nitrogen burn the plant. A lot of times, if they're just using a 20-0-0 lawn food, then that may be the case. But understanding the physiological process of how a plant burns, for example, can arm them with the knowledge that, burning a plant is not the end of the plant. It's actually, just to take the hydroponics example that I provided, if you're pushing that tomato plant and, you start at 1,500, then you move up to 2,000, then 2,500. And, at that point, you see the burn, right? And at that 2,500, that's kind of the farming aspect of it. You just make a note, this crop, this strain of plant likes, burns at 2,500. The sweet spot is like 22. You just step off that threshold. And then what you've done is learn that plant and are able to provide it the level of fertility that you need to get the most out of it. So, hopefully that makes sense. And then, as always, I like to talk about what we're going to be talking about. Next week is going to be a little more direct in terms of the processes that plants utilize to eat the food that's available to it, the light, the ions, the water. How do we set that up to be most efficient for plants? And then we're going to move into, what plants eat, which is a different way of saying what types of fertilizers are we looking at, the balance of the fertilizers, and that'll get us talking about sea energy agriculture and trace elements and hydroponics and base saturation soil testing, which I think is probably my favorite part of this process. Really understanding the sweet spot of life. These things are really well documented, and they're really not accessible through the experts of agriculture from an extension standpoint. It's a very pH-driven process. So providing some insight into how to look for the balance and really coming to terms with the fact that the experts aren't really looking for it to begin with is really insightful. It's not unlike, I get claimed that I'm picking on doctors when I make this point, and I'm really not trying to do that. I know and love many of them. But they prescribe pills for symptoms, right? They're not asking you to change your diet and take a probiotic or take a blood test and look at the mineral balance that your body needs as opposed to somebody else. And one size does not fit all. I mean, if you ever heard of Eat Right for Your Blood Type, it's a expose of, an A, B hybrid or an O blood type and the different enzyme spectrums that they produce that are more conducive to plant proteins or meat proteins. It's the same in soil. Do you have sandy soil or do you have clay soil? Well, it turns out that your calcium magnesium ratio, you want it to be different given the posture. Magnesium creates tightness in soils. So in a sandy soil, you might want 60% calcium, 20% magnesium. In a clay soil where you've already got those properties, you might want 70% calcium and less magnesium. So, you can't really make an equation out of life. You have to react and create, a complex picture and break it down into very digestible, small increments and put it all back together again. So that concludes what I wanted to get across this week. I appreciate being here. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
All right, man, that was information packed.
Yeah, cool.
If you guys like the show, head over to tv.permethos.com. You can watch some previous episodes, or you can subscribe and get access to all of the previous episodes, as well as ask Evan any questions you'd like, anytime you like. All right, we are ready for questions. So if you have any, please enter them into the Q&A. Evan, I wanted to ask you, have you heard of the INA protein, which is the ice nucleation active protein, like the ice creator?
No.
Okay, so this is something Bill Mollison talked about in one of his PDCs. I think it was Bill Mollison. I'm pretty sure it was. Mm-hmm. It was one of the first GMOs was to take that protein, because that protein has a bunch of hairs on it. And what it does is that it's light. So when the plant evaporates or transpires, and the water evaporates, the proteins go up into the atmosphere with that water. And then when it freezes, those hairs are what forms ice crystals or the snowflakes. That's why each snowflake has a different look to it.
I have heard a little bit about that. I saw it was Australian research, I believe, and they were looking at how to use the reality of that process to create antifreezes for plants in freezing conditions. I didn't know it by that vernacular, but tell me again, what was IAE protein? Is that what you said?
It's INA.
INA.
Yeah, ice nucleation active. And so what this GMO was they sprayed it on the strawberry patches in California, and it was basically the same bacteria minus the hairs. It didn't have any hair, so it would outbreed the existing bacteria or take it over, so that their ice crystals wouldn't form, so they could extend the growing season.
Right.
Now the problem, of course, with that is that we need snowflakes and ice in the atmosphere.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right.
Yes.
So it's had a supposedly it had a huge effect on the environment and being able to bring water further inland
Hmm.
into the continent.
That's fascinating. I'm gonna look more into that.
I thought it was very interesting and right along the lines of what you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's take some questions here. We got a couple. Let's see. Jamie is asking, so naturally plants grow in a polyculture. How do these plants compete to share the ECPPM?
Hmm.
Will something low like lettuce not naturally grow by something high like tomatoes?
Hmm. That's a really good question. The simple answer is the further you look, the less we know, right? Which is totally unsatisfying. But what comes to my mind is that, in a polyculture, let's say it's a food forest. I mean, permaculture is permanent agriculture. The goal is to get literally to get the system to maintain itself. I mean, there's chop and drop, and there's different things that the human can do to maximize the production. But in a general sense, you're trying to get the system to take care of itself. Um, in that mode, the system is more powerful by orders of magnitude than any sort of row crop farming, right? I mean, agriculture, as we generally understand it and have conducted it for the past 100 years, is a completely destructive and manipulative process. What permaculture brings is not unlike what we're doing here. For many years, until I really connected with permanent agriculture, I didn't. It's funny because I've been aware of permaculture for 15 years, I guess I would say. And there was maybe the first 5 years, I was frustrated by the term because I kind of saw it as just a catch-all. People did, in other words, it didn't speak to me in terms of process, and so, the concept of permanent agriculture and getting the system to work for itself, what you're basically doing is, rather than instilling it in the system already knows how to do it. I mean, let's not fool ourselves, right? We're coming after the fact here. But what we're doing with the permaculture approach is reinstilling that ability of the system to be what it can be. And in that context, there's an intelligence there. There's a really cool story by Alexander Podolinsky. He's a biodynamic farmer that's well known in the biodynamic realm in Australia, and they have a larger conversation around biodynamics because their soil quality is so bad that their hand was forced to go find really progressive ways of regenerating their soil. Unlike here, where we've got topsoil we can take for granted and take advantage of, that their hand was forced to go find really. So sorry, I just got some feedback there. So what I'm driving at is that what the story that he told, he called humus in the soil jelly pockets, and this is more for a visual and it's somewhat literal, I imagine. But when the soil can organize itself, the humus is created in these jelly pockets, right? And then outside of it, you've got water. And I'm going to try to keep this really simple because it is kind of a simple concept. So what that means is the plant can send roots into the jelly pockets that can decide to eat or not. And it can send roots into the water zones that can decide to drink or not, and vice versa. So what that would mean in a literal sense is when the clouds roll through and cover the sun, the plant's drinking more water than it is photosynthesizing. When the sun comes back out, the plant's photosynthesizing more and leveraging more of its surroundings for its benefit. But it has a choice, right? And so the intelligence of the system, and more directly of the soil itself, provides a context for those plants to coexist. So compare that to what we would do in agriculture. Let's say we were growing lettuce underneath some tomatoes. Or maybe we were rotating in them properly, where we're growing a bunch of spinach and lettuce, and then we start the tomatoes in between them to grow out. And then, by the time they start producing the temperature, and you can intercrop and those kinds of things, which is all really cool stuff. But imagine you wanted to fertilize that tomato because the soil that you had didn't have that intelligence, which is generally the case for the most of agriculture. So if you're coming in to fertilize the tomato, yeah, you're going to burn that lettuce plant away. But in a permaculture context where the system had been allowed to mature and had that intelligence and ability, let's not forget that the forest grows trees with, no fertilizer. and there's very weak and low mineral feeder plants within that forest as well, and they exist in a very happy dynamic. So maybe a long-winded answer. That's just what comes to my mind. But I would say it really depends on the maturity of the soil and the goal of the system. And in permaculture would allow you to work with that in a more progressive way than you would in a farming context. That's a lot of the reason why monoculture has come about, other than the seeming efficiencies of the scale that can be accomplished. A lot of it is not being able to wrap your hands around 1,000 acres. You can't intercrop on 1,000 acres. I guess you could. Good luck with that. So, in a lot of ways, the result of our agriculture now is dependent upon the idea that it's our responsibility to grow the plant to begin with. And I think permaculture really allows that window for us to see and be humbled by the fact that this system knows how to do what it has to do much better than we do.
Oh, I was muted there. Yeah, great answer. All right, next question's from Adam. Adam says, Adam says, as always, Evan's work is incredibly useful to me, and I'm very thankful for his efforts. I would like to subscribe and find the price of great value. Can you explain to me, if this is a series, how many parts are planned? Or how you see the year going on? Will Evan speak weekly for the year, or does this process end and materials are just live for reviewing? Either way, I'm all for supporting. Apologies if this has been explained or is explained elsewhere. I'll start out by saying Permaethos TV is a platform for Evan. So it's a platform and an audience. That's what we provide. So Evan gets to use the platform to spread his message and all of his knowledge to, lucky for us, our users, our members and our customers and our students. And as far as how far Evan takes it, he's not under contract or anything, so it's really up to him. And I'll let you answer from there. How long do you see it going, man?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I try to ask myself that, and for a long time, I'm all in. You guys haven't really gotten to know me as well as we can through the computer yet, but I've been doing this for a long time in a lot of different capacities, and in a lot of ways, what I'm documenting here is my life's work. So, I don't take that lightly. I've got a lot to say. Give you some context. We're 4 weeks in, a month in. We're just in the physical component of bioenergetic agriculture. We'll get into the mineral, then the biological, then the energetic. And then what comes out of that understanding that's, the attempt is to try to get a collective resonance on how to talk about what we talk about. You kind of see I'm bleeding in and out of a lot of it because it's all interconnected. Will come a lot of different, more specialized things, like sprouting and wheatgrass and, the health component of food, water, biodynamic agriculture. So, there's a lot of mouthfuls in that. So what we're doing here is kind of starting from the beginning, and I'm going to try to tell the story to the best of my ability for the entirety of a living system, as well as I can. So, I would imagine there's at least a year of content in there in the wheelbox, and then, where we take that based on kind of what we learn. And, you take today, we stop short, and I don't think there's really a whole lot of value agronomically to getting down into the citric acid cycle and that kind of thing. But you can really make a presentation out of a lot of this. So what we might find is we'll go through the broad stroke, and then we want to circle back and really drill down on a certain thing. And I would invite you guys out there to send me some requests, of things that you might want to hear about. I've got a lot to talk about for a while, but I'm always looking for feedback and really appreciate your words there.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, I think the best way to think about any of these, any series you see on similar to this, where someone is giving you all of this information, it really comes down to the business sense of it. So it needs to make business sense for Evan to continue to do a show, just like it needs to make business sense for a podcaster to continue doing podcasts. And that comes down to the support they receive. So how much support he gets through this show is going to greatly affect how long any businessman would, or man or woman would want to continue putting in all the effort. So with that said, you can support the show. If you want the most direct path to supporting the show, it's learn.permaethos.com, and you'll see progressive farming right there. It's $29 a year. Super good value for all the information and the access that you'll get. Now, we do show the lives, or the recordings here. We record them, or the live shows. We record the live shows, and we put them on tv.permaethos.com. We put them on YouTube, but they don't stay there forever, okay? If you're subscribed, they stay there forever. You'll always have access to watch and download them. You'll always have access to the show notes or any other materials and slides that Evan provides for you guys, for the audience. So I encourage you to go over there and support the show and share this with other people if you want to get other people involved and have them continue to support the show and just keep it going as long as we can. I imagine with a show like this, the content there, it could go on forever. There's so much information and so much new information that comes out.
Yeah, totally true.
Keep going. All right, I think that is all the questions we got. Low questions on this one. I think it's such an advanced, or when you look at when you're breaking down the cell and the individual parts, it becomes very, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of advanced terminology and understanding that needs to happen, a lot of research that, further research that would be, if you're into this kind of thing, I would encourage you to research it more for next week. So the next week's show makes even more sense. And same goes with previous episodes. Watch those previous episodes, research them, so that each episode continuing as we go makes more and more sense. So Evan, with the, and I think I asked this after every episode, with the information that you gave today, with that information, what are some actionable items? How are we going to use this information? Or what can we gain out of this?
Yeah, well, on some levels, this stuff kind of is what it is, right? It's kind of to your point. Not surprising there's not a whole lot of questions there because it's kind of cut and dry information. But what comes to my mind is learning about how a plant burns and how you can approach plants in a literal way from a strain specificity. I mean, the reason people clone plants on a commercial level is because they've learned that plant. If a tomato plant can eat 1,500 parts per million or 3,500 parts per million, the difference there is not. You can compare it to people, right? I mean, I might eat twice as much as the next person just because our metabolisms are different. So just saying tomato, one size doesn't fit all. But it does from a clone standpoint. When that plant, and you find some variability within the same strain of plant from a seed perspective, but from a varietal perspective, you find a really wide range of relevance. And what I've seen happen on a commercial level going into particularly people that buy, and I keep bringing hydroponics up because I'm getting pinged a lot by commercial growers, and they bought like a crop box or a freight farm or a vertigrow system or something commercial that they want to grow a 1/4 acre strawberries for the local markets or something like that. And what the advice that they get from these companies is just follow this formula, and there's no complexity in regards to the crop that they're growing or the stage of growth that it's in, and just very simple things that can really increase the productivity of your operation. So I think the best answer I would be able to give, other than just the cut and dry nature of what some of the things that we learned, is just to think about plants in that context. Think about what a plant wants rather than what we want to get out of it. Same with water, right? It's like, when do we ever consider what water wants? It's kind of strange to personify water, but it's an interesting exercise because it begs the question that there are desires, for lack of a better word, in how water moves, for example, that open up abilities in water that aren't there unless, we allow them, frankly. And it's the same with plants. We can grow a plant, and just to use the hydroponic example, with the hydroponic nutrient, there's 17 elements in water. It doesn't take a rocket science to imagine a plant wants much more than that, right? So that's where the qualitative component of organic growing comes from, and why, on balance, it's more nutritious for people is because when you use something like fish emulsion or any number of organic materials, your rock dusts, etc., right? You get an unconscious diversity of trace elements that don't show up in the agricultural conversation. We're not talking about yttrium, from an extension agent, but that yttrium is vital to certain, it's actually kind of interesting. There's a pathway in the gut microbes of humans where yttrium is vital for the microbe to cycle aluminum from a toxicity standpoint. So the theory is the lack of yttrium in our diets is mitigating the ability of our gut flora to be able to handle the amount of aluminum that we're ingesting, either directly through our skin, through deodorants and things like that, or through pharmaceuticals. It's a lot of the fillers. And so you get this toxicity, and our body can normally handle that kind of thing, but without the yttrium there, the microbes can't do it. So the reason it's lost is because yttrium's not needed by the human body. So we're not talking about yttrium. Yet what we rely on to justify our health, it's central, right? And that, so that kind of took a little bit of a tangent, but the point is, I think if you can think about it, from that context of not what the plant has to have, but what the plant wants, and it can come from a question. Just start by asking the plant, just see what comes up. And these exercises are very worthy. So, that was a little bit of a ramble, but I think that's probably the biggest takeaway for me in an actionable sense, is to be able to think and ask our plants what they want rather than what they have to have.
Yeah, and I think having this deep level understanding of what is going on with a plant and its cells, I think makes troubleshooting a lot easier, and it makes decision making a lot easier. If you have this kind of knowledge, it just makes it easier to understand where I need to put this plant, or what it's going to need, what its needs are going to be, and what it's going to be producing for other plants and for the environment around it. Jamie had a great comment here, fits in just right. Says, "This is free college level material explained so well and simple. It is easy to digest. Thank you."
Oh man, that's awesome. That makes my day, Jamie. Appreciate that.
All right, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Evan.
Pleasure, man. Thank you.
Can't wait till next week.
Yeah, no doubt. Thank all y'all out there. Peace.
Bye, guys.
Later.